While you're listening to this lecture and learning from it, keep in mind how do you get parameter values from the input JSON data? These are the parameter values that Dialogflow has sent over to our webhook, which we want to extract from the JSON data that we receive. In this lecture, we'll implement the helper function makeResponse. We'd spoken earlier about makeResponse. The JSON data that we receive as an input via the post request sent to us from Dialogflow will be sent to this makeResponse method. MakeResponse will do all the heavy lifting of our code. We will extract the parameter values from the JSON data that is sent to us. We'll query the OpenWeather API. We'll construct the response and send it back to Dialogflow. Now, in this particular lecture, we'll look at all of these except actually querying the OpenWeather API. We'll look at that later. We'll set up the rest of the structure of this code first before we actually query OpenWeather API. Now that we have the JSON request, we need to extract parameter values from it. For this, we need to remember the structure of the post request that is sent from Dialogflow to the webhook URL and then extract the parameters accordingly. Within the outer JSON object, we have a result field, and within the result field, we have a parameters field, and this parameter field contains values for the individual parameters specified by name. So there will be the geocity and the date parameter for our weather bot. If you need a reminder, here is a sample JSON request from one of our earlier modules. Now, this is for booking a room, but the date and the geocity parameters remain the same for the weather bot as well. So we have the result field. Within the result, we have parameters, and within the parameters, we have the individual parameters specified by name. We've already got the result field here. Within the result, we access the parameters field, and within the parameters field, we access the individual parameters by name. Parameters.get geo-city and parameters.get date. Now that we have the city and date for which we want the weather information, this point is where we would query the Open Weather API. We're not going to look at it in this particular lecture. We'll look at it in the next lecture. We'll set up the basic structure of the response, though, that has to be sent back from webhook. We'll come back to the part about querying the Open Weather API later. Now, Dialogflow expects that the response from the webhook URL is in a very specific format. There are three fields that Dialogflow expects in the response: speech, display text, and source. All of these three fields are of type string. Speech contains the actual text response to the request that was fulfilled by the server code. Display text is what is shown on your device screen. And finally, source is the source where we got this response from. For now, before we actually query the OpenWeather API, let's just make up a text response for our weather bot. Now, if you want to know more about the requirements and the structure of the response that you need to send back to Dialogflow, you can always look at the docs. Dialogflow.com/docs/fulfillment response. I'm just going to say here the forecast for the city that we passed in for this particular date is, and leave it incomplete for now. We'll fill up the details once we have the OpenWeather API integration. We'll now return this response in the form of a Python dictionary. The display text is what we just set up, that is speech, and the source is our webhook, which connects to the OpenWeather API. The webhook function that actually calls this makeResponse function will take this Python dictionary and construct a JSON response in the format that Dialogflow expects. Now, this web app has to run on a server somewhere, and there are a couple of bits of code that you need to add in to actually get your Flask app to run. So, within your main function, now we are going to execute this particular file, which is called webhook.py, which means that the underscore underscore name underscore underscore variable will be set to main, and within that we set up the port to 5000, that is the default port on which Flask runs, and then simply call app.run. Now app.run is what gets our Flask web app running on the server when we deploy it. Now there are a number of arguments that are passed into app.run. The port defaults to 5000, that is for the Flask app. The host name is set to 0.0.0.0 to have the server available externally. That's so that Dialogflow can hit it with post requests. The default value for the host name is localhost. It assumes that you're running on a local development server, but we want the server to be available externally. So 0.0.0.0 is the right host name to pass in here. We also set debug to false. That's the default anyway. We don't want additional debug information when we run our server. At this point, our server is simple enough that we are confident that it will run. Coming back to the question that we had asked at the beginning of the lecture, we extract the parameter values by knowing the structure of the JSON that's passed in. We have the result field within the outer JSON and the parameters field within result. And then individual parameters are identified by their name.